Okay. Well, I would like to say a very warm welcome to everybody who connected for this webinar. I think it's really a special opportunity we have today with the Egmont Institute, as Professor Jason Stearns agreed to devote some of his precious time to give a talk to us, and he's very, very busy. So, Professor Stearns, I mean, we really appreciate that you you sacrifice your time, and it's very, very early for you now in the place where you're talking. I think it's about 7 o'clock. So again, thank you very, very much. I mean, I don't have to present Professor Stearns. I think everybody knows him. After his first book, Dancing Dancing in the Shadow of Monsters, which has an enormous impact because it's so well written and gave such a deep insight in the specific realities of the war in the Congo. But now, as you probably know, he published the second book last year, which is a major contribution, I think, to the scholarship about the conflict in the East Congo, but not only for the scholarship, but I think also for everybody who's involved in this. He's trying to explain why the conflict in the Congo continues. Why doesn't it stop? What are the reasons for that? And I think he provides an explanation, an argument which is comprehensive, which is coherent, logical, and it really helps you understand what is going on. It does not give a partial explanation, but I think it gives you really, tries to put all the threads together in a conflict that everybody considers to be extremely complex and very difficult to solve. So I think we are very privileged and we're very fortunate that we can have him with us now today. I would really, really advise you to buy and read the book. It's one of the, I think we have several classical books. We had a book by Prophet Young and Thomas Turner about Zaire in the 80s, which was a classic. I think this is really a book which is at the same level to understand what's going on in the Congo. So please read it. And we're also hoping for a French translation, which will make the book more accessible for the Congolese public, which is very important. I think after the talk by Professor Stearns, we have some questions and answers. Even if the webinar is going on in English, I think you can ask your questions in French, English, or I think even Swahili. So there's no problem. But as the book was written in English, we'll hold this talk in English. So Professor Stearns, thank you very much again. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome, everybody. I will share my screen. There we go. You should all be seeing my screen now. Thank you all for attending. Thank you especially to the Egmont Institute for hosting this talk. As Eric said, I'd be happy to take questions and discuss in French. I'll hold the talk in English. I hope to go for about half an hour, and then I can stay on for as long as people want to stay on. Thanks to Eric, thanks to Egmont for hosting this. It's high praise coming from Eric about my book, so you're far too kind in introducing me. What I'll do is I'll talk for about the content of my book, and then try to talk for a little bit at the end about the policy implications of the argument that I am I'm putting forward. So my book is about interests and structures, about the reasons why people go to war, about the importance of figuring out who exactly these people are. Is it the combatants, the commanders, the string-pulling politicians, the money bag financier? And understanding how shifts in the economy, the structure of society, international geopolitics have driven the violence that have affected millions. But of course, first and foremost, my book is about the Congo. The wars, and there are many wars that have been roiling the country since around 1993, that continue today in a very different way than 29 years ago. Today, somewhere around 6 million people are displaced in the Congo, as many as almost any previous time in the Congolese history. It's the third largest displacement crisis in the world after the Ukraine and Syria. But for most, the war is too complex, too marginal, too African for people to care about. And so what I'm trying to do is to peel the layers back to provide a greater understanding. So I want to start with two snapshots. The first is this. On April 27th of last year, Jules Alingete, celebrated financial inspector, the head of the Inspectorat Général des Finances, and the public face of the Congolese government's anti-corruption drive, stepped up to a podium in Houston. You can see him here. He was wearing his trademark uniform, a thick cloth jacket done up to the neck with gold buttons. He was addressing a small conference room of potential investors to convince them to come and invest in the Congo. But what he said, recorded for thousands to see on social media afterwards, shocked many Congolese. He said, "Be assured, we don't have a war in the Congo. We see the war on television. We are in Kinshasa, Mbandaka, Lubumbashi, the big cities, where we have never seen war. And so it's a situation more than 2,000 kilometers from our institutions." The second snapshot, also from last year, the pageantry and fanfare of heads of state arriving to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, Chagum, in Kigali on June 20th. 35 heads of state attended. However, at the same time as Prince Charles, now King Charles, who presided over the meeting, was shaking President Paul Kagame's hand, the M23 rebellion was making inroads in neighboring Congo, allegedly with Rwandan backing. None of the diplomats attending, including Justin Trudeau, Boris Johnson, Muhammadu Buhari, expressed concern. And so in my new book, The War That Doesn't Say Its Name, I try to understand why armed conflict has persisted in the Congo despite numerous peace talks, tens of billions of dollars in international aid, a national army of 130,000 at least pitted against ragtag rebel groups, and one of the largest UN peacekeeping operations in the world. And I think that these snapshots that I've shown you here from Houston and Kigali offer pieces of an answer. Over the past 26 years of fighting, while many have suffered from the conflict, a slim class of commanders and politicians has emerged for whom the conflict has become a source of survival and profit. Meanwhile, Alingete encapsulates the view of many Congolese elites. The war is distant, does not threaten their political survival. The government and armed groups have thus become locked in what I call a perverse symbiosis, alternating fighting with peace talks, neither side really with an interest in ending hostilities permanently. Conflict, as well as perhaps peacemaking, and this is important for the international community, has become an end in itself, the fighting carried forward by its own momentum. Foreign donors and diplomats have provided food, healthcare for millions in need, preventing the Congolese state from collapsing, but they've been unable to bring about transformational change. Congolese have developed their own witty ways to express this sordid equilibrium. Congolese author Nkoli Jean Bofane explores this culture of anti-valeur, unethical behavior in his novel Mathématiques Congolaises. Here, the protagonist, a mathematical savant, puts his creativity to use for a powerful government minister, only to discover that his boss was staging false flag protests in order to manipulate public opinion, not a far-fetched scenario in the Congo. The eccentric Congolese pop star Koffi Olomide put it differently, alluding to the propensity of Congolese elites, or of Congolese in general actually, to turn adversity into a source of profit, even pleasure. He's saying, "Oyo is a system ya lifelo. Moto ezopela kasi tozozikate," which means we live in a system of hell, lifelo. Everywhere the fire is raging, but we don't get burned. And so what is this system ya lifelo, this system of hell? How has it come about? That is the motivation for the book. And so I'm going to give a very quick summary to start off with about the first part of the Congo War, and then talk about the history of this current part of the Congo War, to get to the core of my presentation, which is really about the Congolese state, the Rwandan state, their interests, and producing this perverse symbiosis that I spoke about. As we know, in 1996, a coalition of regional countries, and especially Rwanda, Uganda, and Angola, invaded the Congo in support of a Congolese rebellion. They overthrew Mobutu Sese Seko, who had been in power for 32 years. That coalition installed Laurent Désiré Kabila, a mercurial and veteran rebel, as president in 1997. Laurent Kabila, whose assassination was commemorated yesterday in the Congo, fell out quickly with Rwanda and Uganda, worrying about their overbearing influence within the government. That sparked a new war, which began in August of 1998 and split the country into 4 parts. That's the Second Congo War. These wars had names: the First War, the War of Liberation, the War of the AFDL, or the Second War, the War of the RCD, the War of Aggression, the War of Occupation. In 2003, a peace deal was signed, the Accord Global et Inclusif, that reunified the country after 5 years of brutal war, forging a transitional government. You can see on your screen the protagonists, the power sharing agreement, 1+4, the 4+1 of this transitional government. A new constitution was signed, enshrining the rights of citizens as never before, creating democratic institutions and decentralizing power to the provinces, inaugurating what is called the Third Republic. These changes had real impacts on the lives of millions of Congolese. By 2006, the number of internally displaced in the Congo had declined to 1.3 million, a third of what had been 3 years earlier. 130,000 soldiers, including 30,000 children, were demobilized. However, by 2006, these trends were being reversed. The main challenge to the nascent stability came from the malcontents of the peace deal. First, part of the former Congolese Rally for Democracy, or RCD, then a series of Mai local militia rebelled against this new transitional government. Armed groups proliferated, in part because of a failure to reform the army, spawning a wave of defections of army officers who fomented rebellion. In part, this was because of poverty and local contestations over identity and land in the Eastern Highlands. You can see here in this graph on the screen, the internal displacement in the DRC and how it's gone up and down. You can see that peak in 2002, just before the transitional government, then a decline, and that's the hope, the promise of Sun City, as I call it, the end of the wars, and then slowly but surely the ratcheting up of internal displaced to a level today that was unseen previously in Congolese history. Here is the gentleman, the protagonist of this episode of fighting, Laurent Nkunda, now arrested in Rwanda, still in Rwanda. And so what I argue is that paradoxically, even as this violence escalated, the nomenclature was toned down. The United Nations peacekeeping mission was transformed into a stabilization mission. As armed groups mushroomed, there was no peace process to engage them, no real demobilization program, and only a few local reconciliation initiatives. So this period, this post-2003 period when violence started escalating again and ramping up, is, as Congolese call it, and as the title of my book says, this is the war that does not say its name. La guerre qui ne dit pas son nom. And so to understand, what I want to do now is talk about the interests of the actors, especially the Congolese and the Rwandan governments. The Rwandan government, and I believe that often one of the reasons that international intervention has failed to come to grips with the conflict is because we've fundamentally misunderstood the interests of these various actors and how they've engaged. The Rwandan government, a key player then as now with the current M23 conflict, was the first mover in this latest phase of the war starting in 2003, provoking a crisis almost as soon as the transitional began in 2003, and then backing major armed groups, especially the CNDP in the Eastern Congo between then and now. But what were its interests? This study of interest gets to the heart of my book, as too often analysts and policymakers have assumed and not scrutinized the interests of major belligerents. I try to debunk two theories when it comes to Rwanda, that of ethnic solidarity and of economic profiteering. Yes, Rwanda has made a fortune off smuggling and racketeering in the Eastern Congo. The data is easily available, and I go over this data in my book. But neither the CNDP nor the M23 really helped a whole lot with economic profiteering. In fact, Rwanda's export of Congolese minerals skyrocketed in the years since between when it withdrew in 2013 and the latest M23 rebellion that started in November of 2021. Alternatively, diplomats and pundits often claim that Rwanda has intervened in the Congo out of solidarity with Tutsi there. That also clashes with dozens of interviews I've conducted with Congolese Tutsi soldiers and community leaders, many of whom have felt betrayed and manipulated by Rwanda. And so I guess the remaining question is, well, what about security? Supporters of the Rwandan government often mention forefront security as the overriding imperative, in particular, the presence of the rebels of the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or FDLR, some of whom participated in the 1994 genocide. There's no doubt that the FDLR threat formed an important part of the decision-making process, but it's difficult to disentangle real, quote unquote, security threats from symbolic or political security. Much of the narrative underpinning the legitimacy of the RPF is tied up in the genocide and in the protection of the nation, and in particular the Tutsi community in Rwanda. The threat of the FDLR bolsters the notion that there is a greater good, a security imperative that justifies the repression of the opposition and restrictions on civil liberties, which are hallmarks of the RPF rule. Add to that the need to manage dissent within the Rwandan army, from which the greatest threat to the survival of authoritarian government comes. And I think this goes a fair way in explaining the decision-making process of the Rwandan government. What about the Congo? In the Congo, political elites have been complicit in the wars, but in a very different way than in Rwanda. Here, political elites' approach to the conflict has been a mixture of apathy, fatalism, and opportunism. Many of the political leaders that I interviewed for this book, even some of those from the East, expressed little actual knowledge about or engagement with the situation there. Ces gens ont toujours fait la guerre à l'Est. Those people have always been at war. One parliamentarian from Kinshasa told me, nothing we can do will change that. The war in the Eastern Congo was extremely peripheral to the survival of politicians in Kinshasa. They weren't punished at the polls for their neglect of the East, nor was the fighting there a security threat for the country's capital, over 1,000 miles away. And so my book puts an emphasis on this political culture, which I believe is characterized by two impulses: normalization of the violence, making it seem like it's something that was always there, and essentialization of this violence, making it seem that something that people do by their very nature. And I can say more about those impulses in the question and answer if you're interested. While some politicians may be influenced by stereotypes surrounding the violence, others are well informed of the government complicity and yet do little to change this, as it would be risky for them to do so. The main reason for this stems from the importance of the military during the period following the transitional government of 2003 to 2006. In other words, political elites in Kinshasa were concerned about military dissent, in fact, more concerned about military dissent within the army than about the grievances of the local population. And so by deploying most of the army to the east, keeping officers' salaries low, but their discretionary allowances and bonuses high, and by giving them a free-handed racketeering, political elites protected themselves from possible coups and enriched themselves through kickback schemes. This lack of priority regarding discipline is probably not surprising. The terms of the peace deal required Joseph Kabila, to integrate his army, bringing his former enemies into the senior ranks of the FARDC, and raising the possibility that they could overthrow him. After all, his own father had been killed in office by a bodyguard, and Kabila was said to be worried about his personal safety, wearing bulletproof vests in public. This system of fragmentation and clientelism has become self-reinforcing and is now baked into the organization of the Congolese state, rendering the state itself invested in the persistence of conflict. Tshisekedi himself has denounced how the mafia inside the army, he did this in Ituri recently, and has said Mboka Kufa. In fact, he said Mboka Kufa Kala, which means the state died a long time ago. He himself has denounced, and if you I spoke with one of his ministers recently, and he said, l'armée à refaire. Le problème, il n'y a pas d'armée en RDC. There is no army in the Congo. So they themselves understand this, and yes, have a hard time leaving the same system that has been created. It can be observed, for example, in how members of the security services are compensated. Payment within the security service is structured in such a way that officers struggle to prosper in the absence of armed conflict. In 2014, for example, when I did this study, up to more than 90% of officers' remuneration, their pay, depended on legal or extra-legal payments directly linked to military operations. In other words, they had to be deployed in military operations to make money. Both the fragmentation of actors and the interests of these actors produce what I describe as involution. This is a term from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. And what this means is that over time, the main stakeholders' approach to conflict has turned inwards, becoming invested in their own reproduction, becoming stuck, if you will, seeing conflict as an end in itself. There is, and I think this goes against some of the theories put forward by Congolese leaders, there is no grand conspiracy as I see it. I don't think that there's a conspiracy in smoke-filled rooms in the Congo to keep the country balkanized, for example. Due to the multiplicity of players and the shadowy nature of these networks that are in power, each actor finds it difficult to imagine another logic, let alone take concrete actions to reform, even though almost every actor within the current system, if you ask them, they find this system itself reprehensible. The violence, therefore, has become systemic, exceeding the intentions of individual actors in the system. International actors, including Belgium, but also the United States, where I'm from, are part of this process. After all, they brokered and funded much of the peace process. They've dramatically shaped the economy and politics of the Congolese over the past 20 years. And I find two main faults amongst these actors. Donors and peacemakers focused on technocratic reforms rather than addressing the inequalities built into the structure of the Congolese state. And they ignored parallel developments in the private sector that dramatically entrenched the political elites in charge of the state. Now, many of the donors working on the Congo, you can see here on this graph how much the Congolese economy, this is the GDP in the Congo, grew during the peace process from 2003 up until today. The Congo's economy has boomed. In fact, the latest budget in the Congo that was issued just a short while ago is a budget for $14 billion, which is extremely small, but a lot larger. Under Kabila, budgets were around $5 billion. So under Tshisekedi, the budget, even if they don't execute all $14 billion, the budget has at least doubled in the last 3 years under Tshisekedi, 4 years under Tshisekedi, which is enormous. But yet much of this money is gone, feeds into this neo-patrimonial system of running the state. Now, many of the donors that I speak with have a deep appreciation of this. They're not stupid. Of the 37 donors and diplomats I interviewed for this book, most of them articulated frustration with the Congolese state and understood that the main interests of the Congolese state were not aligned with the imperatives of efficiency, transparency, and accountability that perhaps those donors would have liked to see. And yet, donor policy all too often ended up shoring up the Congolese state, providing enough resources to prevent that state from collapsing, but unable to bring about substantial reforms. In part, this is due to the internal dysfunctions of the donor bureaucracy. We understand that the state doesn't want to truly reform. We build new accounting systems for them, but that just means they steal money from elsewhere, is what one diplomat told me about reforms that they had supported in the management of civil servants. Our capital tells us we need to support the Congo because the Congo is an important place for us to be. These bureaucratic incentives often create a way of framing the problems facing the Congo into abstract technocratic terms that strip away politics. In general, a large part of donor policy interpreted state weakness and conflict as a dysfunction that needed to be fixed, instead of an architecture set up to serve the interests of political elites. The second flaw in how donors approached the conflict was evident in how the economy was managed. The rapid liberalization of the Congolese economy during the same period brought about dramatic growth, but also compromised the peace process and helped entrench conflict dynamics related to the predatory state. Here you can see Joseph Kabila shaking hands with one of his main business partners and political partners during this period, Dan Gertler. Donors and diplomats were complicit in this privatization of the Congolese state as they implemented policies based on preconceived templates of peace building, the liberal peace, and refrained from enforcing stricter regulatory guidelines and conditionalities. At the beginning of the transition, the Congolese economy was tiny, 9 billion in terms of the GDP, and state revenues were only 730 million for a country of 51 million. By comparison, the budget of New York University, which is in part where I'm based, is around $9 billion. And so the budget of one university in the United States is larger than the budget of the Congo last year. The size of the Congolese economy grew very quickly following the peace process as the privatization took place, and most of the country's most valuable mining concessions were doled out. After all, under Mobutu, the entire economy was nationalized, and so it was under Joseph Kabila that much of the mining wealth of the country was privatized and sold off. This privatization was backed and encouraged by donors who believed that private investment would not undermine the peace deal, but the peace process, but bolster that process. This is a central tenet of liberal peace building, which assumes that a rights-based democracy and a market-oriented economy are the best foundations for sustained and equitable peace. When the World Bank, for example, helped draft the 2002 mining law and financed the reform of state-run companies, and foreign embassies encouraged private business development, they chose not to scrutinize too closely the close connection between politics and business. Some of the investments in mining, for example, were extremely questionable, made far beneath market prices by shadowy offshore companies. Estimates for losses of just a few of these deals made by Dan Gertler here range up to $5 billion. That's just for a few deals. That's the money lost in just a few deals. Dan Gertler at one point was worth over $1 billion himself in wealth. Almost all of that came from the Congo. While less mediatized, tax evasion and transfer pricing by reputable multinational corporations has been of a similar magnitude. Since the Congolese government's main tax for mining companies is on profits, many declare losses for their local subsidiaries while transferring the profits to a more lenient tax jurisdiction. For example, a study of Glencore, the largest mining company in the Congo and in the world, found that its Congolese subsidiary, Kamoto Copper Company, declared losses of hundreds of millions of dollars between 2009 and 2013, and yet Glencore's Canadian subsidiary during the same period ran a net profit of over $400 million. This is just one mining deal. In the long run, the involvement of international business people and diplomats did not resemble a centrally controlled conspiracy to fuel war in the Congo, the complot de balkanisation that some people talk about. Instead, donors and diplomats acted uncritically in accordance with the belief that privatization and foreign investment would bring greater prosperity and stability in the Congo. Once the floodgates of private investment were open, international capital then moved in with little control by political elites in individual countries, ending up creating few jobs for Congolese and leaving little profit in the country. The question, and I'm going to end soon, the question then is, well, how do you create an elite bargain? How do you create an investment in the stability of the Congo? This is something that has focused the attention of many political economists around the world. There's been many books written recently by Francis Fukuyama, by Stéphane Dercon, by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, just to name a few, talking about how to create political pacts or elite bargains that are interested in stability. They talk about, for examples of Indonesia and Nepal, where elite pacts amongst elites against lower class militancy forged an interest by political elites, often forged together with corruption. These were often very corrupt deals, and yet you had elites try to forge stability and drive economic growth because they were being threatened by lower class militancy. This helped them forge these elite pacts, ones you do not have in the Congo. Other examples come from countries in Africa, such as Rwanda and Ethiopia, where you have authoritarianism, at least initially, although not anymore in Ethiopia, forging a kind of domestic stability and an investment in development from the top down. Now, I would argue that the Congolese situation is very different and that those models are not helpful in the Congo. The Congo is not Rwanda, is not Ethiopia, and probably cannot be those countries. That's just not the makeup of the Congo. The Congo is more similar to Indonesia in the sense of its fragmented elites, the lack of history of a central state that precedes colonialism, a plural and fragmented society. And the nature of that makes an elite bargain very difficult. And so here I would urge policymakers to look to this pluralism and dissent as the greatest asset of Congolese society. the fact that that you have this extremely vibrant push from below, this grassroots push from below to further to further democracy and accountability that exists, and people need to draw on that. And I think that precisely the 2018 elections that most people agree were not won by Félix Tshisekedi, but by the runner-up Martin Fayulu. Undermined this, not because I'm a fan of Martin Fayulu, but because people, I think, deserve to trust more in what looks like a very chaotic and often corrupt Congolese democracy, but extremely vibrant as well. And international complicity, including the complicity of the US government, was critical in brokering this deal, this 2018 deal between Joseph Kabila and Félix Tshisekedi. And so I think that better models are looking to countries like Brazil, which are also enormous countries, fragmented countries, where pressure for reform has often come from this vibrancy. In Brazil, from social movements, from very strong social movements that drove the land reform process, that drove social reforms, that drove health reform, that have made Brazil into an example of how poverty reduction can be done, especially in the period before Jair Bolsonaro. Or even in my home country, the United States, where social movements were critical in bringing about civil rights reform. Yesterday, we celebrated the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. He was part of that grassroots effort of reforming the racist structures of the United States. But it also succeeded in rooting out corruption that was part of the way public life was run in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. In New York City and Chicago were run by corrupt political machines, and it was bottom-up pressure from business elites and civil society that brought about those reforms. And so I think it's similar situations in the Congo that we can look to in for reform. A final word, perhaps. There were inflections in the past, and I'm happy to talk about them, points at which donors and governments could have intervened to bring an end to the conflict. 1996 was a time like this, for example, or even before that. Today, however, simple solutions to the conflict are hard to come by. The conflict has transformed trade networks, social hierarchies, mentalities, political structures. There's no one strand of this cat's cradle of conflict that can be tugged to collapse it. The challenges facing the Congolese are generational. At the local level, they will have to contend with the demobilization of hundreds of armed groups. There are over 120 now there, and the psychological and social scars of decades of war. At the national level, they'll have to battle a political elite that has become less accountable and more corrupt as massive investment has flowed into the country. Meanwhile, on the international scene, they'll have to contend with the relatively apathetic African community of states and a Western donor community that has done little to constrain international capital and often fails to live up to its high-minded human rights rhetoric. These are not technical battles, but struggles for power, for control over local and national politics. So I'll end there. Again, I'm grateful to Egmont Institute, and I'm very happy to have to answer any questions.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Professor Stearns. I'm sure there will be enormous lot of questions. Maybe if you, I don't know if everybody saw the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, where you can. I think the easiest way to do it, if you could write your questions on the Q&A, it'll be easier than if we start talking all together. Well, but I just, as there are still not many questions, I'll take the advantage of asking one myself. What is a bit striking is that you had under Kabila, you had some kind of a political elite that has had some degree of consolidation, but now you have Tshisekedi, you have a whole new group of people coming from UDPS, coming from diaspora, etc. And most of all, they have a very limited knowledge, most often, of what's happening in the East. If it's already very difficult for people in the East to understand what's happening, it's even more difficult for them. So do you have any idea of how what the relationship was between is between this new political elite, including security services, especially towards the system that was entrenched? So the people that were, as you say, that the military and political bourgeoisie that has some interest in the continuation of the conflict. Was it a conflict? Did they try to accommodate? Are they helpless? I mean, do you have any idea of this, or maybe it's
so
not?
I think that the facts, you mentioned a couple of things that I think are key there. I think first, and this is in general for Tshisekedi in terms of reforms, it's been difficult for him to reform the state because of this proliferation of actors without having central control. And when I say central control, obviously at the beginning, he was constrained by the fact that he was in an alliance and a coalition with Joseph Kabila. That was made things difficult for him, but even control within the UDPS. Tshisekedi came to power, as you said, he was foreign to the state, but he was actually even relatively foreign to his own political party, to the UDPS.
Mm-hmm.
He surrounded himself by people who were, many of whom were not members of the UDPS. We just heard there's this big saga now about Bifor Biselele in the Congo. Biselele is one of his is part of this, and Eminence Grise, one of these political advisors who were very close to him, friends of his from Belgium, but not a longstanding member of the UDPS. Many of the people around him, Vidi Chimanga, Bifor Biselele, Jean-Claude Kabongo, Claude Ibalanki, Serge Chibangu is an exception to that. He is a UDPS member, but many of these people are not longstanding UDPS operatives. Secondly, I think that his father, the legacy of his father, Etienne Tshisekedi, who was obviously, all the things that we know, a hero in Congolese fight for democracy and so on and so forth, but it also centralized control so much within the UDPS that he had undermined the institutions within the UDPS. The UDPS had become extremely attached to the person of Etienne Tshisekedi. So when he passes away and he hands over to Félix Tshisekedi, there's a struggle for power within the UDPS, and there's a lack of cohesion within the UDPS itself. In response to this, what Tshisekedi has done is he's created a proliferation of people around him. I was just looking at the Congolese budget today, which is huge. I mean, people need to, I think, give Tshisekedi credit for growing the Congolese budget so much. And yet, the budget line for the presidency in the Congo is larger than it has ever been. The budget line for the presidency in the Congo is larger than healthcare. The budget line for the presidency in the Congo is larger than defense. It's really astounding to see how much money, for example, in 2022, if you look at the Ministry of Budget figures, it's larger than almost any budget line in the entire, including higher education, defense, and so on and so forth. And I think this is an indication of how he's tried to manage this cohesion. Instead of trying to centralize power, he's just reinforced this proliferation of networks. Now, you asked a question about the East. I think that's key in understanding the East. He hasn't tried to centralize control. I think he's tried to he's reinforced this sort of networked operations in terms of the East. Initially, it was Claude Ibalanki who was dealing with the East. He's been marginalized. Now it's Serge Chibangu. Serge Chibangu, who was the UDPS representative in the United States, not somebody who knows the East. Tshisekedi doesn't know the East very well. Repeatedly, people who he doesn't know the East terribly well. When he initially came into power, he deferred to Kabila. And then he dismantled Kabila's networks, again, to his credit. But I think it was this lack of understanding of the East that allowed him also to defer to Paul Kagame. It was in the initial part of his presidency that we saw many, many operations by the Rwandan army in the east of the country. And so you can see it's a very scattershot, very ad hoc approach to the East. You don't see much of a strategy. You don't see much of a projection of how things are done. And I think he's been unable to tackle this mafia, as he calls it, within his own army and security services that is a key part of the problem as well. So it's not to justify, obviously, anything that Rwanda or the M23 has done, but it's to understand, I think, this very chaotic and scattershot approach that you see coming from the Congolese presidency.
Okay, thank you very much. Je voudrais peut-être ajouter, si vous avez des questions, s'il y a des personnes qui sont moins, disons, qui connaissent un peu moins l'anglais, on peut toujours poser les questions en français, en anglais, en swahili, peut-être même en lingala. Donc, bon. Bon, Kofi Olomide. Peut-être on peut commencer avec la première question. We can start with the first question. So, what role can Belgium play in the conflict?
What role can it play in the conflict? What role has it played in the conflict? I mean, Belgium can play, I think, a very constructive role. I mean, for me in general, you know, hope does not reside in the international community. And ultimately, if the Congo will be reformed, it will be due to its own extremely vibrant and progressive forces within the country. And I think that the best that outsiders, such as myself, can do is provide space for those voices to flourish. And so I think Belgium is the same thing. I think we made a mistake, including Belgium, especially the United States in 2018, in this deal that was struck to put Tshisekedi in power, not because I have anything against Felix Tshisekedi, but because it undermined, I think, a lot of the democratic forces in the country. And so what can Belgium do? Belgium can try to reinforce this upswelling of democratic accountability that exists in the country by supporting civil society, by supporting free and fair elections. I think that's critical. It could have played, Belgium, like many other forces, did not denounce Rwanda's backing of the M23. It was the United States that did so early on, even when many other countries, including Belgium, were well aware of Rwanda's support to the M23. It only belatedly did so after it became clear to everybody this was taking place. And so I think Belgium it can play a role within the European Union, in particular, where people often defer to Belgium on the Congo, with regards to the crisis in the East, pushing back against Rwandan backing for the M23, but also with regards to the Congolese state. And as I said before, I think the Congolese state itself is a key actor and a key part of the problem.
Okay, well then, thank you very much. Then the next one by Mr. Jordan Anderson. He says, to what causes do you attribute the resumption of Rwanda backing for the renewed M23 rebellion? So why did they back M23 again? And do you still see this as something that is running counter to Rwanda's economic model? So it's maybe does it serve or not the Rwanda's economy?
It's difficult to know exactly what happened in the minds of people in Kigali in November of 2021, but the best we can understand is that, or informed by interviews with people in the ground and people who were close to this decision-making process, is it looks like the decision to intervene and back the M23 came about due to regional competition between Uganda and Rwanda. Uganda had just deployed UPDF, its own army, into the Eastern Congo to conduct joint operations with the Congolese state in Operation Shujaa in Ituri and North Kivu territories against the ADF. This was following terrorist attacks in downtown Kampala in November of 2021. Security officials in Rwanda saw this as a potential threat. They thought that the Ugandans would use this as a means to destabilize potentially Rwanda, or at least block Rwandan influence in the Eastern DRC. And so the initial decision to support the M23 in November of 2021 by the Rwandans, we believe came in that context. Now that's changed after Uganda's intervention. The president of the Sun, Muhoozi Museveni, the son of the president, rather, of Uganda, Muhoozi Museveni, engaged in the shuttle diplomacy back and forth with his quote-unquote uncle, Paul Kagame, in Kigali, that diminished these tensions, and which you can see now looks much more like some sort of complicity between the two countries and the M23. So, for example, the Bunagana attacks of last year that took Bunagana, there seems to have been complicity by the Ugandan government in those attacks. And so things have changed, but the origin seems to have been regional competition. Does it run counter to Rwanda's economic model? Yes and no. Counter in the sense that it brings, the biggest export that Rwanda has, its physical biggest export is now gold. And as I say in the presentation, that actually had nothing to do with military occupation of the Eastern Congo. They don't need to be in the Eastern Congo to get the gold smuggled out of the Eastern Congo to be exported as Rwandan gold. So I think that but the biggest export beyond material exports is actually their reputation. There's a reason that Starbucks and Bill Gates and Bill Clinton and Rick Warren, et cetera, Tony Blair, all see Rwanda as a champion in Africa, as a leader in Africa, and that's because of its reputation, of Paul Kagame's reputation, of the country's reputation. And so backing the M23 really damages its reputation. And so I do think in the long run, that's a extremely damaging aspect of Rwanda's economic model. I think, it's not clear. Rwanda does benefit from instability in the Eastern Congo, even if they don't benefit from occupation of the Eastern Congo. And so fomenting instability is beneficial to it. Occupying the Eastern Congo is not. And so it's difficult for them to resolve that contradiction in their foreign policy.
Well, then the next question, I think it has been partly answered, is about support of Rwanda for M23. Now, do you think there are other external hands supporting the M23, or is it just a kind of internal fragmentation and porosity? And then the $20 billion question, what would be the solution to silence the guns in Congo?
Well, I think are there other, I mean, there's many factors that go into the M23, and it's not just the Rwandan government. I mean, the Congolese government itself signed a peace deal with the M23 in 2013 that they never implemented. The Rwandan and Ugandan governments never arrested the M23 rebels who had been basically based in military camps in Rwanda and Uganda. So there's many things there, I think, to unpack. A lot of the root causes of the conflict in the East, including local struggles over land and power, the discrimination and stigmatization of the Congolese Tutsi community, which is a very real thing that people should talk about, that Tshisekedi himself at some point has talked about, has not been resolved. So there are many different factors. And unfortunately, much like his predecessor, Tshisekedi doesn't have a comprehensive strategy for dealing with any of these factors. There's no process. You know, if you ask me, what needs to be done about the conflict in Eastern Congo, at least create a process. There is no process. There's no overarching strategy or process. What you have is ad hoc, is fragmented. It's a little bit of military, a little bit of diplomacy. So I think critical to any lasting solution is having a process that's going to be, as I said, generational. Many of these problems are extremely deeply rooted, go back to the colonial era. They have to do with land reform in the East. They have to do with questions of citizenship and exclusion, social marginalization of the Congolese Tutsi community, but also of youth and poor people across the Eastern Congo. That's the Mai, I think, problem has a lot to do with that. Has to do with administrative reform. And so create that process that tackles these issues in a serious way. And now, for the first time in Congolese history, there's actually resources. The Congolese state is running $1 billion surplus, which is unheard of in Congolese history. And then, of course, I mean, I think for the short term, the way this problem was solved in 2009 and 2013, every time there was a Rwandan-backed rebellion, the CNDP and then the M23, the short-term solution came through by pressuring the Rwandan government. And I don't think this time will be any different. But there's a big difference between a short-term solution, which has to involve pressure on the Rwandan government, and a long-term solution that is really much more about the Congolese state and the nature of the Congolese state and this process that I mentioned.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow, that's very interesting. Now, there's another question from Mrs. Katrien van der Schoot, who's a journalist at Belgian television. She said that the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs is currently heading towards Angola and Congo to talk about the situation in the East. Is that an opportunity or just a window dressing event? I think it touches a bit on the role of Angola, which we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so there's two processes now. You have the Luanda process, which is a regional process that's led by Angola, and you have the domestic process that's led by the Kenyans and the Congolese. It's the Nairobi process, but actually no longer taking place in Nairobi. I think that both of these processes are important, but the real calls, the real decisions will be made behind the scenes and not in big meetings. And so, yes, I think that the regional process is extremely important. It's extremely important in galvanizing pressure on Rwanda in particular. And so that is not window dressing. Galvanizing pressure on Rwanda, I think I would be wary of trying to create very long-term processes in which people are invested. Peacekeeping in the Congo and peacemaking has always also been a business. And once you create these long-term processes, the Addis Ababa framework, for example, they can be extremely cumbersome. And also, as I've pointed out before, build momentum that's self-perpetuating. I would avoid that. I think with regards to the M23, it's quite simple. Really, the short-term solution, as I said, is pressure on Rwanda. And then the long-term solution is very difficult, which is reforming the Congolese state along the lines that I talked about. But in terms of Angola, I think Angola, Kenya is Kenya's a new player in the Congo, which is good and bad. They don't have much understanding of Congolese politics, but they have enormous business acumen that they're bringing to the table and investments. The Kenyan government, Equity Bank, many Kenyan businessmen are now, the Congo's joined the East African community. They're seeing Congo as a business opportunity, and they're very much not along the lines of what Uganda and Rwanda are doing, which is extraction of resources. The Kenyans actually, I think, are in it more for business opportunities that could actually bring something to the Congolese people as well, potentially, if carried out correctly. And so that's, I think, a source for an opportunity, a source for hope. The Angolans, are about their own influence in the Congo. Obviously, they want to keep their influence, not least because they have extremely valuable oil concessions off the shore that they don't want Congo to be pushing them or demanding the rights to. So I think Angola can be a counterweight to Rwanda, but also comes with its own baggage.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have another question by Mrs. Elise Cuny. I think there are two questions here to try to summarize. The first thing is that Professor Stearns, you said that there is no army, but you have Banyamulenge officers who are deserting the army to join rebel movements in the east, where they organize well. There are important military forces and tactics. So if this is the case, why does the DRC government is so reluctant to integrate or to negotiate with the M23, because they are also a relevant military force and they could be an asset for the army? At least that's how I understand the question. And the second one is there still an interest for the DRC government to promote ethnic divisions and hate in the Kivu?
So the first question, I mean, I'm not entirely sure that if I understand the first question. There is an army, obviously. It's the FARDC. It's a very clear army with a very clear hierarchy. What I was trying to say, it's a very inefficient army, and it's an army that's riven with corruption, as the president himself has said. So I think the problems with the army have to do with trying to reform that army, but it's very much an existing army. So I'm not entirely sure if that answers the first question. I'm happy to do a follow-up if I didn't understand the first question. With regards to negotiating with the M23 and ethnic divisions and hate in the Kivu, this is a difficult question. You know, the Congolese government negotiating with the, it's difficult for me to see a deal that they could strike with the M23, to be very frank. It's difficult for me to see Sultani Makenga becoming a deputy regional military commander again, as he was once in South Kivu. I think there's just enormous lack of trust between the various sides in this. I think some members of the M23 can be brought back into the government. But I don't think a deal, as we saw in 2009, the one with the CNDP, which shares sovereignty in the East, which basically integrated the CNDP and ceded part of the national territory to the CNDP, that's viable. I think that if there's a deal with the M23, it has to be a deal to integrate some of their officers and leaders into the Congolese government. And yes, implement the 2013 peace deal that actually was talking about a lot of longstanding issues. Now, you mentioned some of these issues. You mentioned ethnic divisions and hate in the East. Again, these are real issues. This is not fake. You have Martin Fayulu going around, including the United States and Canada, saying there is no such thing as Banyamulenge. Il n'y a nulle part en RDC une ethnie qui s'appelle des Banyamulenge. This is what Martin Fayulu has said. This is what other leaders in the Congo have said. This is nonsense. Of course, there is a thing called the Banyamulenge community. They've existed in the Congo. There are clear historical records. You can go through these records. Isidore Ndaiwel, perhaps the greatest living Congolese historian, says very clearly, Banyamulenge immigrated to the Congo pre-independence in 1885. Pre-creation of the Congo Free State in 1885. And so I think that this is a very, very real issue. And the Tshisekedi at the beginning of his mandate seemed willing to tackle these issues. But it's obviously extremely difficult. There's an it's not a popular issue for them to deal. So I think that for me, the M23 are not the legitimate representatives of any Tutsi community. They themselves have been forcefully recruiting Tutsi civilians in the past. So I don't think that we need to combine those two together. In fact, it's detrimental to combine the M23 with the issue of stigmatization and discrimination of Congolese Tutsi, which is a very real issue. I think the visionary leadership would say we need to deal with this, and I'm going to deal with this. We need to help bring back Congolese Tutsi refugees, tens of thousands of whom are in Rwanda. I think those are legitimate issues to deal with. What is not legitimate is for the Congolese, is for the M23 to say that they are the legitimate negotiators in that process, or for the Rwandan government, for that matter, to say that as well. The Rwandan government has been very, I think, speaks out of both sides of its mouth. It says it cares enormously about Congolese Tutsi and about hate speech, but they actually have a track record of abusing the Congolese Tutsi community themselves. So I don't think that either the M23 or the Rwandan government are the legitimate interlocutors, but these issues, as you point out, as the person asking this question pointed out, are extremely important issues that need to be grappled with.
Okay, that's thank you again. Now the next question is again by Mrs. van der Schoot, maybe a short answer because I have a lot of questions left. She asked, so she said she has been following the Lucha movement. How do you assess the chances to change the system by participating in politics?
I have many friends in the Lucha movement. I'm a huge admirer of Lucha, which began in Goma in 2012 and became a huge force in national politics, especially around the electoral process of 2018, but still remains so. And the question you raise is a matter of debate with Lucha. I think some members of Lucha think that, and this is a question for social movements across the continent, in order to bring about political change, you need to be in politics. And so you have to engage in politics. And so some members of Lucha, I think, are favorable to that. And not just Lucha, but Filimbi and others are thinking about and starting and getting engaged in formal politics as a political party. But I think that would not be as Lucha. I think that would be, they would have to leave Lucha to do so, and that has been the long-standing position of Lucha. So I think if, in terms of formal political participation, running for office, that would have to be the case. In terms of their role in the political scene, I mean, they're extremely important. I mean, even though a large Lucha demonstration is maybe 200 people or 300 people, they're not large, but symbolically, what they're trying to do, I think, is extremely valuable and important, which is to transform la politique from something dirty to something valuable, to transform la place publique from something dirty and to be co-opted to something that is sacred and something that's important. You can see this when they have demonstrations. They will clean up. They'll do salongo in the streets after their demonstrations to clean up the trash, to show people that, to be Congolese comes with rights, but also comes with responsibilities. That's my short, Eric asked me to be short. That's my short answer to that question.
Thank you. So I think next question is within the same area. It comes from Professor Henri-Paul Bolap, who, by the way, has some very interesting writings about more fundamental about what you're talking about. He's referring to the examples you gave about the US and Brazil that could be maybe inspiring examples for change in the Congo. So how can we bring about that kind of process, which he calls demand-side governance in the Congo, when the ruling elites have manipulated the conflicts in the East, scapegoating the international community in a sense, and also Rwanda for the sufferings for the people in the DRC. So how could you do this?
I mean, that's the big question for me. How can outsiders actually, I mean, there's various different proposals. So for example, what you can see in recent years from especially the British government and the American government is that the private sector is going to do this, right? And so there's, since I would say 2015, 2016, there's a fatigue that set in amongst some donors. Belgians less so, but also that the Congolese state is just not something we can work with. So these efforts of civil service reform and so on and so forth, that's just not going to work. What you need to do is you need to create a vibrant private sector, and it's this business for peace sort of mentality. And this vibrant private sector will then eventually create demand for better governance. And so that's how the reform process happens. I'm a little bit less sanguine or optimistic about that process, because there have been, I think, more examples of how the private sector has actually parasitized the public sector in the Congo than actually promoted a viable private sector. And so it's possible that could be achieved, but I think that more important is, greater solidarity for the forces that exist in the Congo that really want to bring about fundamental change. We could see us abandon that solidarity in 2018, and I think it's because there was a lack of trust in the Congolese. I was talking to diplomats in 2018, especially American diplomats, when they struck a deal between Felix Tshisekedi and Joseph Kabila. And when I asked them, and I said, well, you know that Felix didn't win the elections, that it was Martin Fayulu, they said, yes, but this is the best deal we could get. And they said it's impossible, it's naive to think that Martin Fayulu could ever become president of the Congo because Joseph Kabila is just too strong. And we needed a deal with him to get him out. Now, I think what we can see after those elections is the house of cards, really, that Kabila's government was. It collapsed very quickly, and Tshisekedi moved very quickly and was able very quickly to dismantle the entire architecture that Joseph Kabila allegedly, this powerhouse, was a mirage. And I think very often the way we see things is like that as outsiders. We think that it's impossible, that we need to deal with the devil to make things happen. And I don't think that's necessarily always the case. And so I think that with regards to 2018, there was a missed opportunity, not because I'm in love with Martin Fayulu, but because I think that there was an enormous outpouring of Congolese. I mean, they risked their lives, they were tear gassed, they were stoned, they were killed in defense of democracy. And what they got was not democracy, what they got was a deal between elites, passing power between Joseph Kabila and Felix Tshisekedi. And so I think that there needs to be greater solidarity with the forces that are there, that are very alive, that we know very well, who actually do want to promote real reform from the grassroots up. So I know that's a relatively vague answer, and I'd be happy to discuss further, but that's how I would approach this question.
That's a very important one. Now, the next one talks about the culture of impunity that has been, has been pervasive and going on for decades in the Congo, creating a lot of grievances and trauma produced it. So the question is, does your book talk a little bit more about this and how we can overcome those grief and trauma produced by the impunity over the last decades?
Well, you're absolutely right to highlight that impunity is one of the characteristics of the Congolese political trajectory. Unfortunately, there has never been there was a sham of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was never a tribunal for the Congo, as Denis Mukwege, for example, has been calling for many years. There have been very few people at the most senior level held responsible. There is an understanding that people at the most senior level actually will not face dramatic consequences. We can see this, I think, very viscerally under Tshisekedi. Tshisekedi has prosecuted a lot of people, especially through the IGF, the Inspectorat Général des Finances. Jules Alinguete has done real work and producing extremely interesting investigations. And so there's this demand for accountability, and yet in the end of the day, almost everybody, for example, who was cited in the Procès de 100 jours, the 100-day program that he had for developing the country when he first came into office, enormous, hundreds of millions of dollars stolen. People were locked up, including his own chief of staff, Vital Kamerhe. But Vital was released. Almost everybody who was cited, I think, except for one or two people, who were arrested, were released after that. So I think this is a good example. In the army, it's a similar thing. We have Inspectorat Général de l'Armée that's being run by one of the most notorious abusers in the country. We've never had a real audit of the army and the security service. So the impunity you speak about is financial impunity as well as human rights abuse impunity. My book is not a fine-grained analysis of that phenomenon, but I very much agree that phenomenon is central to it. Again, it gets back to this notion that many people are outraged by this, by the impunity with which the ruling elite behaves themselves, and they're not listened to, and that creates an enormous. We're just in the process of doing another public opinion poll with the research institute that I'm affiliated with, Ebuteli and the Congo Research Group, and what you can see is very interesting, which is that the people, ils ont assez, ras-le-bol is the answer. The level of popularity for everybody, Fayulu, Tshisekedi, Kabila, is below 30%. That people are just fed up. And I think that this impunity gets to that.
Yeah, thank you again. For instance, now, the next one is about, it says that the conflict in the East, it doesn't get any attention until there are outside actors getting involved. Now we see that as one of the outside actors seems to be the Islamic State. And then we think about Kasindi, of course. Do you have an idea about the rise of the radical Islam in this region and how this changes the local dynamics?
Well, first of all, it's important to say that I think that There is an Islamist movement in the Eastern DRC, the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF. It's a very, very important actor. It's the deadliest armed group in the Congo by far, outside of the Congolese army itself. It's the deadliest actor in the Eastern Congo. They're extremely brutal. They are driven in part by, and in part, not the wholly, but in part, they're driven by an extreme interpretation of Islam, going back to the Tabligh sect in the splits within the Tabligh sect in Uganda in the early 1990s. So that's very important. The Congolese Muslim community is not associated with this almost at all. There are Congolese Muslims, part of the ADF. The Congolese Muslims make up maybe 3% of the population, including in this part of the Congo. So it's a very different situation than the radical Islam you find amongst Boko Haram or the Al-Shabaab or other radical Islamist organizations throughout Africa and the Middle East that take place within countries where you have even northern Mozambique with large Muslim populations that have been stigmatized, marginalized. That's not the case in the Congo. The Congo is a rear base for the ADF, but is not, largely speaking, a recruitment place for the ADF. A lot of the recruits come from East Africa. And so I think that's a very different situation. And so the reason they're there is because they can be there. It's a vast area. There's natural resources, and the Congolese security services are not well organized. And so that is, I think, one of the reasons. So the rise of radical Islam that you speak about that exists is not a rise in radical Islam in the Congo. It's a rise in radical Islam in other parts in the region. It changes dynamic a bit. The Congolese government would certainly like to position themselves as meriting the sympathy of the international community, especially the United States. It cares a lot. And of course, there are members of the US security establishment that are extremely focused on radical Islam for reasons that I'm sure everybody understands. But it actually hasn't galvanized international opinion in the way I think that many members of the Congolese government would like in support of the government. There's been no blank checks written to Tshisekedi because of radical Islam in the region that I can see, at least. So I think it's changed things a bit, but not a whole lot. We could talk a whole lot more about the ADF and the killings and so on and so forth. But to that precise question, I think that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. The next one will be difficult to answer, I think, because you were referring to the halabol that is going on, and it is especially obvious in Goma. People are fed up with the killing of innocent people. How will or can this end?
That's a big question. How will it end? As I said before, unfortunately, I think with regards to the M23, the situation, it's again, despite the fact that it's the most organized, disciplined armed group not disciplined in the sense that they treat people well, but disciplined, internally disciplined. A commander says go and the armed group goes. It's a fairly hierarchical, organized armed group. M23 is actually relatively easy to deal with. It's pressure on. If Rwanda wanted to bring an end to the M23 tomorrow, they could probably do so. And so I think pressure really on Rwanda. Again, there's many factors with regards to the M23, but Rwanda has enormous influence over that armed group. I think that's the least we could say. But with regards to the broader dynamics, again, the escalation of violence in the Eastern Congo is only in part, and a small part actually linked to the M23. The 120 different armed groups of the 6 million people displaced in the Eastern Congo, fewer than 10% of those people are displaced because of the M23. And those dynamics are extremely difficult to grapple because they're so anchored in local dynamics, because they depend largely on the weakness of the Congolese state and the complicity of the Congolese state. And so really the key there is reforming the Congolese state. That is a generational task. But in order to start that process, you need to ask the right questions. This current administration of Tshisekedi, I think it's done many things that are important, including free primary education, which has been an important step, including increasing revenues, which has been important. What it's failed to do is start a credible reform process of its own army in the East. They're now blaming Rwanda. They have an entire campaign blaming Rwanda for reasons that I understand, that I myself have highlighted, but there's almost nothing that I can see, at least, that they're doing to hold their own officers and own hierarchies accountable. In fact, the declaration of the État de siège that happened in 2021 is part of the problem. And so now we're over a year and a half into the État de siège. État de siège is the opposite of holding military accountable. You're giving more power to the military to behave in whatever way they want to. And so there is accountability in a very scattershot way. They'll fire this guy, they'll arrest this guy, they'll release that person, but there's not a comprehensive effort to reform the army. So I think that's where the emphasis needs to be placed.
I don't know whether there's a reason for optimism or pessimism. So the next one is in French. Donc, il s'agit de la candidature du docteur Mukwege, dont tout le monde parle actuellement. Est-ce qu'une candidature et une victoire du docteur Mukwege, c'est un moyen de mettre fin à la guerre?
Ouais. Merci pour cette question. Je pense que, effectivement, beaucoup de gens en parlent. Je pense que c'est une possibilité. Lui-même en parle, le docteur Mukwege. Et évidemment, il est dans une sorte de coalition maintenant avec deux autres possibles candidats, Martin Fayulu et Matata Ponyo, par rapport à différentes questions de réforme en RDC. Est-ce que sa candidature serait un moyen de mettre fin à cette guerre? Je pense qu'il y a plusieurs défis. C'est quelqu'un qui est populaire. J'ai parlé du ras-le-bol de la population. La population aime Dr Mukwege en général. Et donc, lui est une exception à ce ras-le-bol parce qu'il est perçu comme quelqu'un qui vient en dehors de cette élite corrompue congolaise. Donc, ça, c'est une force, un grand avantage, je pense qu'il a. Il a formulé, je pense, une critique profonde par rapport à l'implication du Rwanda, comme aussi par rapport à l'implication des élites congolaises par rapport au conflit à l'Est, donc ce qui est aussi un avantage, une bonne chose. Il pose des bonnes questions, aussi par rapport à l'impunité en général. Parmi ses défauts ou parmi ses faiblesses pourrait être le fait qu'il n'a pas une machine politique, il n'a pas un parti politique. Pour pouvoir pas seulement gagner le pouvoir, mais aussi transformer le pouvoir, il faut avoir un appareil, il faut avoir une machine. Il n'y a pas cette machine, donc imaginons-nous qu'il arrive au pouvoir, qu'il soit élu comme personne. Comment transformer l'appareil? Il faut avoir une coalition qui est majoritaire. Le gouvernement en RDC, en principe, sort de la majorité au Parlement. Est-ce qu'il va contrôler ce Parlement? Est-ce qu'il sera contraint, comme Tshisekedi avant lui, de faire une coalition avec des gens qui sont là? Comment il peut mettre en œuvre des réformes sans avoir cet appareil? Donc, pour gagner le pouvoir et pour mettre en œuvre des réformes, pour moi, il faut avoir un appareil, un mécanisme de le faire. Il ne l'a pas construit. Et ça, pour moi, c'est un grand défi, je pense, pour lui. Et évidemment, même s'il a un appareil, s'il a la vision, les intérêts sont très profonds, les intérêts extérieurs et intérieurs par rapport à ce conflit, ce que tu viens de décrire dans la présentation ici. Et donc, je pense que là, le défi serait énorme. Mais oui, je pense que ce serait un pas intéressant et potentiellement transformateur par rapport à ce conflit.
Okay, well, next one is in English about MONUSCO. Who wants MONUSCO out of the country and why? Yeah. And should MONUSCO leave DRC?
Well, who wants the MONUSCO? I mean, I think many people, the Congolese elites speak un double langage. They, out of both sides of the mouth, if you will, about this question, because they benefit from the MONUSCO being there as well. I mean, as much as they go on and on about how Joseph Kabila in particular used to say this, but members of Tshisekedi's government have said it as well, that they wanted MONUSCO to leave. But at the same time, they benefit enormously from MONUSCO being there. They benefit because, you know, it's easy to blame a peacekeeping mission. If every time there's violence, we can point the finger at them. Why aren't they doing something? And they also are, I mean, it's $1 billion of annual budget. They inject a lot of money into the economy. And so I think from the political elites, there's this double langage that comes from the Congolese population. I think many people in the Congo, and as you can see this through polling, many people in the Congo don't see the reason for MONUSCO to be there. They think they do very little. And I have some sympathy with that in the sense that MONUSCO at the moment are bystanders. They're politically marginal, they're militarily marginal. They're not at the center either of the peace process or of the military operations in Eastern Congo, and yet their military budget is twice as large as the budget for national defense of the country, or their budget, not their military budget, but their total budget. And so I think that there's a very good case to say MONUSCO should be transformed. Now, MONUSCO performs many functions besides the military function that it's best known for. They are the biggest logistician in the country. They transport people from left to right. They are the eyes and ears of the international community. So they follow the political process. They report on human rights violations, on humanitarian situation. All of that is extremely important, but that doesn't require, over 10,000 peacekeepers in the East. That doesn't require a budget of $1 billion. And so I think that there's a good reason to transform this mission. And I think it is time to transform this mission to something else, to put responsibility squarely where it lies, which is within the hands of the region and within the hands of, in particular, of the Congolese state.
Well, the next one, thank you. The next one is an interesting one also. You have the networks of Kabila and the networks of Tshisekedi. But also you have in the banking, sector, and where there's a lot of money laundering also going on. Does it still play an important role in financing or supporting the networks of Kabila and possibly Tshisekedi? And is these practices in the financial sector, including money laundering, do they block or do they limit efforts to end corruption and to promote democratic accountability?
Yeah, I mean, these are important questions. I think that a lot has been written about Kabila's, the various networks within the former Kabila government that were involved in this sort of racketeering and money laundering. Congo hold-up investigations in which the organizations I'm affiliated with participated as well are an example of this, the BGFI Bank and others. So I think that's been fairly well documented. I think that there are indications that Tshisekedi is aware of this. He's tried to set up institutions to reform and to push back against money laundering, in part also because this was a request or a demand of requirement of international financial institutions. And yet, at the same time, you can also see new allegations popping up regarding people and individuals linked to the Tshisekedi government. So I think these networks are being transformed. I think there's no doubt about that. I see a little sign that there's a mass arrest of people involved in those networks. Certainly not people linked to Kabila. I don't see dozens of them being arrested and thrown in jail. And there is signs that people who are close to Tshisekedi are getting involved in these networks, even if he himself, there's little evidence that he himself personally has benefited from that. But the question is about the banking and money laundering sector. And I think that, there's been some reforms to this sector. There's been some blacklisting of some banks. And this is not my narrow expertise, I should say as well. There are others that know this better than I do. But I do think that there's been some improvements on this. I think generally speaking, there's perhaps this is not exactly what you're asking, but the extraction that happens in the Congo, if you look at capital flight, for example, and there's good documented, which is well documented, the flight of capital out of the Congo, most of which happens through corruption, either legal or illegal corruption. There's legal corruption as well, or I would call it corruption at least, where multinational corporations just transfer out profits and evade taxes in the Congo and send that elsewhere. Trade invoicing and things like this to prevent being taxed in country. And so not much has been done in that regard. So I think the Congo is still a place of extraction, and the international financial system is complicit in that extraction. The Congo government has been better at taxation. They've been quite harsh at taxation. Many international companies are upset with that. This is how the profits have grown, the revenues have grown so much. You've seen, you have this budget now of $14 billion. I don't think they actually have $14 billion, but even if they have $12 billion, that's more than twice as much as under Joseph Kabila. It's in part of that, but I think that more broadly speaking, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on offshore tax havens, on capital flight, in which the international financial institutions are complicit and multinational corporations are complicit as well. Anyway, that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I wanted to say that.
Thank you very much. Next one is about elections again. So as we know that Tshisekedi didn't win the last elections, but now the person who asked the question says that polling data shows that he will not win in December either, if the election December, of course. Now, suppose that President Tshisekedi tries to manipulate the results to remain in power. What will be the effect? I mean, can the DRC survive if he does so?
First of all, I just want to pay homage to the fact that these are fantastic questions, and in fact, much better questions than I've had in many of my book presentations. So thank you all for these questions. Now, it's unclear what polling stands at the moment. We're just in the process of doing another poll with our partner Bercy in the Congo. Our past poll actually shows that Tshisekedi was winning would win a plurality of the votes. Now things change enormously. We still have at least 11 months to go before elections. Things can change enormously during this period. Our past poll showed that everybody was unpopular, but Tshisekedi was the least unpopular of the people who had said they're going to run. Let's say, for example, Mukwege throws his hat into the ring. I think that would change everything. I think Katumbi has been actually quite off the political scene. And so if he steps onto the political scene in a big way, that could change things as well. But the last poll we did is actually showing Tshisekedi winning a plurality of votes. I forget now what it was. It was 30-some%, I think. And so that was interesting, but it's certainly not a commanding lead, you could say. But because it's only a plurality and not a majority of the votes, the implication of that is that the opposition was able to stitch together a coalition that they could also win the election. And so I think there's a lot that remains to be seen in terms of what's going to happen ahead of the next election. I would say Tshisekedi is in a very strong position, however, both because he is relatively popular with all of the caveats that come with that, and also in particular because he controls the electoral institutions. He controls the CENI quite well. He controls the judicial apparatus, and he's put in reforms there. We wrote a long report in French about this that we published with Ebuteli and Congo Research Group last year, about how he's controlled the various electoral institutions. And so that gives him, I think, a distinct advantage going into this electoral cycle.
Yeah, but I think the question was also if he manipulates the results.
Will he stay in power? I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think that.
Will there be violence? Will there be violence? Will there be conflict? Yeah.
I mean, what the past has shown us is that I mean, one of the things that Tshisekedi was able to do when he came to power was really divide as well a lot of civil society. You saw a lot of civil society leaders actually with enormous sympathy for the UDPS, for Tshisekedi, for a variety of reasons, because, you know, of the historical legacy of his father, because he's not Joseph Kabila, because they really think that he genuinely wants to change something. You could see many luminaries of Congolese civil society. I'm talking about Georges Kapiamba, even people like Jean-Claude Katende have ambiguous relationships with Tshisekedi, really hesitate, especially in the early days, of criticizing him. You have Sylvain Lumu. Many of these, you know, leading civil society figures were quite, I would say, soft, even though the church itself was very strong, and the church then had to moderate its approach as well. So, you know, I think a lot would depend on the church. If Tshisekedi, you know, rigs the election, and everybody knows that he rigs the election, and the church comes out and says we have to mobilize against this, then he may have to recalibrate. If the church stays quiet, then they're really the critical factor here. It is possible, obviously, for civil society to come out. It's possible to mobilize, to have protests in the streets. But my inclination is to think that if the church stays quiet, the Catholic Church stays quiet, then the chances popular mobilization would have in overthrowing the government would not be great.
Okay, we only have 6 minutes left, I think. So there's still many questions left, but I think that most of the answers have been given, even for the questions that are still to come. There is one that is really related specifically to your Rift Valley project about armed groups, I think. That the person who has a question says that many actions by armed groups, including the one recent attack in Kasindi, are meant to draw attention, and so groups are competing for attention. To what extent do they collaborate, despite the geographic distances?
To what extent do they collaborate or spar? So very few of these armed groups actually collaborate with each other. There are some coalitions, but many of those coalitions pass through the Congolese government. So for example, there's a coalition against the M23 that's been stitched together, but that's been stitched together through the Congolese government that spans, for example, APCLS, which is rooted in the Hunde community of Masisi, CMC, which is rooted in the Hutu community of Rutshuru, the FDLR, and other armed groups against the M23. That passes through the Congolese government. Alone, those coalitions sometimes come together, like the coalition around CNPSC in South Kivu around Muliakutumba. But they're often, that's an exception, I would say, rather than something that happens often. So there's actually fairly few coalitions that come together. Do they spar? No, most of the fighting is between neighboring armed groups. There's not a lot of armed groups. Most of these groups are hemmed in by their ethnic boundaries, if you will. They're rooted in ethnic groups. It's the nature of popular mobilization in rural areas in the Congo is still very much along ethnic lines. So most of these armed groups, including the M23, if you will, are APCLS, CMC, Yakutumba, Makanaki, Raya Mutamboki groups, Kodeko certainly, and so on and so forth. Almost all of these groups are groups that are, and so that limits them in terms of how much they can travel and how much. So there's enormous sparring locally between armed groups, but not very much beyond the local level.
Okay, well, I would just suggest that time is running out. We just take two more, and I will abuse my position to select these. There is one question whether it's possible to name some FRDC people who are involved in the military mafia system or the military bourgeoisie, as you called it.
Well, I mean, it's a very decentralized system. It's not a centralized system, so it's difficult to say we have this one person that is key or critical, this or that. Chacun parapluie is what they say in the FARDC. You know, everybody has its own patronage. There's been some fantastic studies that I recommend to you by Albert Malukisa on the police, the traffic police in Kinshasa, or by Maria Erickson-Baz about also police and how police make money off how the patronage networks are run within the police. And it's a very similar, and what they say is they call it leisam punda, which means to feed the horse. You have to feed the horse. You have to obey the hand that feeds you. And so Opération Retour, there's a lot of kickbacks, and all these kickbacks work within patronage networks. And these patronage networks are usually clustered around certain people. I mean, you could name Tango Fort, Gabriel Amici, for example. As I said, the person in charge of Inspectorat des Finances is critical in this. It has his own patronage networks. Many ex-RCD officers are in that patronage network, for example. There are ex-FAS patronage networks. There are some ethnic patronage networks that go, for example, to the Hunde community. There are some that are critical within the Bembe community. So some of them are ethnic, some of them are about their past affiliation with RCD or ex-FAS, and so on and so forth. Everybody's involved in this. It's the nature of the army. Then it's not to say that they like it, but it's just the way it works.
Okay, well, maybe take a last one if you agree, because I mean, again, time is running out. You talked about the complexity of challenges for the stability in the Congo and President Tshisekedi. Are you finally calling on the necessity of new leadership in this country? It comes from Dr. Fraternel Amouri, who's US based also.
Sorry, I'm just trying, okay. New leadership, am I asking for new leadership in the country? I mean, I think that there is new leadership that's needed in the Congo, obviously. It has been striking, however, to what degree, you know, new and bright and wonderful youths, women, men, have been co-opted into this current system, which is why I think it's important to highlight the system and not the individuals. It's very difficult to break out of this mold. And so I think if you talk about new leadership, you need to talk about new structures as well. What Lucha is trying to do, I think, is extremely important. I think you need new political parties and new leadership within those political parties, new functioning of political parties that don't just operate as a means to extract resources, but to hold leaders accountable. Within even political parties, that needs to happen. We published a whole series of reports last year on the way political parties function from the UDPS to the PPRD, and they're often centered around key personalities and leaders. There's extremely little accountability within political parties. And so, yes, new leaders, but new structures as well, new modes of operating as well. And that takes a long time to build.
Okay, well, Professor Stearns, I think we can go on for 2 weeks, 2 more weeks on the subject. But I mean, unfortunately, there's no time for that, and we must take into account your your other work also. So thank you so very, very much for this extremely fascinating talk you gave to us. We're really very, very grateful. And thank you very much for all the participants. We were with about 74 participants, which is really much. Thank you very much again. And really, I advise everyone to read the book and also consult the Ebutili reports, who are really very, very interesting. I just, maybe finally, I want to underline that Professor Stearns is one of the few people who really created or contributed to create an independent research unit in the Congo, because all analysis have been monopolized by non-Congolese, but now there's really for the first time that we have an independent research unit in Kinshasa itself, and it makes, I think it makes an important contribution to the understanding of the situation. So thank you very much for your analysis, and especially for all your work for the Congo. And I hope we can continue another time.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.